The coach broke its axle at dusk. A farmer lifted both twins from the mud. I was fixing the fence on the south side of the property when I heard it. Not a crack, more like a groan, low and wooden, the kind of sound a thing makes when it gives up. Couldn't see the road from where I stood, not through the cottonwoods, but I knew the sound. Wagon wheel finding soft ground at the wrong angle, axle taking the weight wrong. I'd heard it before. I set my tools down, didn't run. There wasn't panic in me that way. I walked through the cottonwoods and came out on the other side, and what I saw was a coach. Not a farm wagon, a proper passenger coach. The two-horse kind you'd see carrying mail or folks traveling between towns. Tilted hard to the right, front axle sunk into the mud where the road dipped near the creek crossing. One of the horses was still pulling, confused and skittering, and the driver was down in the mud trying to calm it. The other horse had gone still, head low, eyes showing white at the edges. That was the worst sign. There was a woman standing in the road. She'd gotten herself out. She was holding her skirts up out of the mud, and she was watching the coach with the particular stillness of someone who has already run through all the bad possibilities in her head and is now just waiting to see which one arrives. She wasn't crying. I noticed that first. Not crying, not calling out, not looking around for help, just looking at the problem. Then I heard the sound from inside the coach. Two voices, small and high and very frightened. I walked faster. The driver saw me coming and called out something I didn't catch. The nearer horse was making noise. I held up a hand to him, meaning I see it, I see it. I went straight to the coach door, which was on the low side, half buried in the tilt, and I had to yank the handle twice before it swung. Inside, up on the raised side, were two girls. 4 years old maybe. 5. I could never tell at first, couldn't tell for months, honestly, until I knew them. They were twins and they looked identical except that one of them had mud on her face and the other hadn't, which told me the muddy one had gone for the door first and gotten it open partway before the coach leaned further and the door swung back on her. The clean one was holding the muddy one's hand. Both of them were watching me. I said, "I'm going to hand you down. Don't let go of each other if you can help it." I didn't wait for an answer. I reached in and got the muddy one under the arms. She was heavier than I expected, solid the way children are at that age, all that dense bone and muscle still close to the surface, and I lifted her clear and stepped back and set her feet in the road. She didn't make a sound. The clean one came next, and she grabbed onto my collar and held on the whole way down. I had to pry her fingers loose gently once I had her feet on the ground. The woman was there. She'd moved without me noticing. She went to her knees in the mud, the skirts and all, and she pulled both girls against her and said something into their hair I couldn't hear. I didn't need to hear it. I know what that sound means. I looked back at the coach. The axle was bad, cracked through at the housing, wood and metal both. I walked around to the driver, who was a young man, not more than 22, 23, freckled and shaken, with mud up past both boots. He said, "I tried to swing wide of the dip." I said, "You couldn't have known it was soft. We had rain 3 days ago and this spot holds it." He said, "I've got to get to Harmon's Creek by morning, sir. I've got the mail." I looked at the axle again. Then I looked at the sky. Probably an hour of good light left, maybe less. The air had that smell it gets when the warmth is going out of it, dry earth cooling, creek damp underneath. I said, "You're not getting this coach to Harmon's Creek tonight. You might not be getting it out of this dip tonight. The axle's broken through, not just cracked. You'll need a blacksmith and a new fitting, and that fitting will have to come from Harmon's or from Caulfield, and neither one is close." He said, "The horses." I said, "Your horses can come with me. I've got a barn." He looked at the woman. She was still crouched in the road with the two girls. Her eyes came up to mine. I said, "You and the girls too. I've got room." She didn't say yes right away, which I respected. She looked at me the way a careful person looks at a stranger, taking stock, running the numbers. I stood still and let her look. I wasn't offended. She didn't know me from any man on any road in any territory. She had 2 small children and a broken-down coach and the dark coming in, and she'd been cautious all her life probably, or had learned to be. Either way, it was the right instinct. After a moment she said, "How far?" I said, "1/4 mile, just through those trees." She said, "And you are?" I said, "Harlan Co. I farm the section north of this road, have for 16 years. She said, "We'll accept your offer, Mr. Co. Thank you." Her name, I found out later, was Marta Ellison Brennan before she married. She'd grown up in Ohio and come west with her husband 6 years back, and her husband had died of a fever the previous winter, a long illness that took its time with him, and she was traveling now from one town to another for reasons she didn't explain that first night, and I didn't ask. The girls were Dora and June. The muddy one was Dora. I know that now. That first evening I couldn't have told you which was which. We unhooked the horses from the coach and led them through the cottonwoods. The young driver, his name was Aldous Fenn, brought the mail satchel and the luggage, 2 bags, one his and one Marta's, and he carried both without being asked. I offered to take one and he said no. I thought well of that. My house is not a big house. It is a square house, built plain, 2 rooms on the ground floor and a sleeping loft I'd never used because it was always just me. The kitchen and the main room are one room. The fireplace is large because the winters here are serious, and I built it myself the second year. Before the first house I'd put up burned one December while I was in Harmon's Creek buying feed. I came back to a foundation and ash and nothing else. So the second fireplace went up bigger and solid, the kind you build when you're not going to build another one. I had food enough. I always kept enough. And wood in and water up from the well that I'd hauled that morning without knowing I'd need it for 4 people. I got the fire going first. That's always first, especially with children wet and frightened and the evening coming cold. While I worked the fire I heard Marta behind me, moving in the room without being asked to, unpacking the bag she'd brought in, finding dry clothes for the girls, talking to them in a quiet and steady voice the whole time. Not coddling. Not the high voice people sometimes use with small children, as if volume and pitch can substitute for steadiness. Just a plain and even voice, telling them what she was doing and what was coming next and what everything was called, as if giving them the sequence of things was the same as giving them solid ground. Maybe it was. It seemed to settle them. Aldous Fenn sat at my table and put his face in both hands for a moment. He looked like a boy who'd had his first real bad day of work. Not broken, just pressed on. I said, "When does the mail need to arrive?" He said, "Morning, sir." I said, "I've got a good horse. Knows that road well, done it 100 times. If you know how to ride, you could get to Harmon's Creek tonight, leave my horse at the livery there, and come back tomorrow with a team to pull the coach out. Blacksmith's name is Purvis. He's on the east end of the main street. Tell him Harlan Co. sent you and describe the axle fitting. He'll know what you need." He looked up. I said, "The mail should go. That's your job." He said, "You'd lend me your horse." I said, "Take the roan. She's in the second stall. She doesn't love strangers much, but she'll do the work." He was gone within the half hour, the mail satchel across his back, riding toward Harmon's Creek in the last of the light. I watched him go from the barn doorway, stood there a minute listening to the hoof beats fade, then went back inside. The girls were at the fire. Dora had a blanket around her shoulders, and June was holding the edge of it from outside, as if she intended to share it whether Dora had agreed or not. Marta was at my stove. I don't know what she'd found to cook, but something was already on, the smell of onion and fat in a hot pan, which is one of the best smells there is when you've been outside in the cold. I said, "You didn't have to do that." She said, "You need to eat, so do we. Where do you keep the salt?" I told her. She didn't look at me when I told her, just reached for the shelf and found it without looking again. She knew where things were, or knew where things should be, which in a plain house amounts to the same thing. I stood there a moment and then I went and sat in my chair and watched the girls at the fire and didn't say anything. There was nothing to say right then. There was something in the room, something I didn't quite have the words for, that I didn't want to disturb with talk. June looked over her shoulder at me after a while. She said, "Are you a farmer?" I said, "I am." She said, "What do you grow?" I said, "Corn mostly, some wheat, potatoes when the ground is right." She thought about this the way children think about things when they're actually interested, which is more seriously than most adults think about most things. She said, "My papa grew apples but he died." I said, "I know, I'm sorry about that." She turned back to the fire. Dora hadn't looked at me at all yet. The blanket had gotten bigger somehow, stretched enough that both of them were under it, and they were sitting shoulder to shoulder watching the flames the way children and old men do, like the fire is saying something worth listening to. We ate together at my table. 4 people at a table built for 1 man. I'd never noticed before how closely the table fit what I needed, no more, no less. Now it felt like something I'd failed to plan for, some future I hadn't thought to make room for. But there was room. Barely, but we fit. Marta passed the bread without being asked and poured water for the girls before they thought to want it, and kept the conversation plain and easy. Asked me about the land, how long I'd worked it, whether the winters were hard, whether I'd had trouble with the soil near the creek. Not polite company questions. Working questions. The questions of someone who understood what the answers would mean. I told her about the land. The clay near the creek that didn't drain right and drowned the roots in wet years. The north section that had grown good corn for a few seasons and then just stopped yielding, something gone out of the soil, and I'd had to let it go back to grass and put cattle on it instead. The well I dug the 3rd year that came up alkaline, barely fit for the animals and not for me, and the better well I'd found the year after, 40 yards further west, following a line of willows I'd been walking past without paying enough attention. The frost that took the wheat crop my 5th year came in 3 weeks earlier than it had any right to, and I'd come out in the morning and stood in the field and looked at it lying flat and black and understood that I was in trouble. She listened the way some people listen, which is to actually hear what you say and hold on to it and connect it to what came before. She asked about the frost. What had I done after? I told her. Borrowed against the next year's crop from a man in Harmon's Creek, Dennison his name, a straight dealer. Replanted what I could in the remaining season. Found work in town through the winter to cover the rest, fence work mostly, some carpentry, helping old Gorman haul freight for a month when his back went bad. By the following spring I was clear again. Not ahead. Just clear and no longer owing anyone anything. She said that took nerve. I said it took not having another choice. She said that's most nerve I've found. I didn't say anything back to that. She was right, and I didn't feel the need to say so out loud. The girls fell asleep at the table before the meal was finished, just put their heads down on their arms, one after the other, barely 2 minutes apart, like they'd agreed to it without speaking. Marta carried them to the cot I'd made up in the main room without waking either of them. That takes a particular kind of careful, slow and committed, no hesitation in the movement. She came back and sat across from me and poured herself a little more water. Outside the wind had picked up. It moved through the cottonwoods the way wind does in that stand, a particular sound, a kind of rinsing. I'd lived with that sound so long I usually didn't notice it. I noticed it that night. She said, "You didn't have to send him on your horse." I said, "The mail should go." She said, "What if he doesn't bring the horse back?" I said, "He will." She said, "You don't worry much, do you?" I said, "I don't worry about what's already done." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "I saw you come through those trees at the road. You didn't run. I noticed that. Most men would have run or at least moved faster." I said, "Running doesn't get a broken axle fixed any faster, doesn't help the situation any sooner." She said, "I know that. That's not what I meant." I didn't answer. I understood what she meant, or I thought I did, but I didn't want to be the one to say it. She said, "You looked at the coach first, before you looked at me. You went straight to where the sound was coming from." I said, I heard the children. She said, yes. You heard them. A quiet settled between us. The fire had burned down some, and I put another log on, the same way I always did it, leaning over from the chair without fully standing. She watched me do it. She said, my husband was a good man. I want you to know I'm not traveling away from something bad. I'm just traveling. I have somewhere I have to get to. I said, you don't have to explain yourself to me. She said, I know I don't. Another quiet, longer this time. She said, I think you were about to ask where I was headed. I said I wasn't. She said no. I said I wasn't going to ask. She looked at me for a moment, and then the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something just short of it. She said, all right, Mr. Coe. I said, Harlan. She said, all right, Harlan. I checked the barn after that. The 4 horses all settled, all fed, water up, the roan gone, and a gap in the second stall that I noticed without particularly meaning to. I stood there a moment in the barn doorway with the smell of hay and cold air and horse, looking at that gap, and then I closed the door and latched it. When I came back in, the lamp in the loft was lit, a thin line of yellow at the edge of the loft floor, and the house was quiet except for the girls breathing on the cot in the corner. One of them, I didn't know which, I still couldn't tell them apart then, had pulled the blanket up over her face so only a bit of dark hair showed. I sat in my chair a long time before I slept. The fire settled and popped the way fires do, and outside the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the house held the 4 of us in it, the way a good house does, just holding, just being big enough, nothing more required of it than that. Here's what I want to tell you about that night, about what it was. I've tried to say it before and not gotten it right, so I'll try again. I am not a man who had a great deal. I mean that in the plain accounting way, the farm, the one good well, enough livestock to work the place and not much more. But I also mean it in the other way. I'd had a woman once, years before any of this. Her name was Catherine, and she was from Missouri, and she'd come out with real intentions, and the marriage hadn't been mean or broken, nothing like that. She just found that this land and this kind of life were not what she'd thought they'd be, and she'd gone back east after 2 years. I don't fault her for it. Not any more than I fault anyone for finding out what they need and going to where they can find it. After she left, it was just me and the work and the seasons, and some years that was enough and some years it wasn't, and you don't tell anyone which is which. You get up in the morning. You do what needs doing. What I felt sitting in that chair, with those 2 girls asleep on the cot in the corner of my room and that woman asleep in the loft, the sound of 4 people breathing in a house that had only ever held one, what I felt wasn't happiness exactly. Not yet. It was something closer to recognition. Like finding a joint you'd cut years ago that you thought was off by a hair, and you try it and it fits clean. You didn't know it was wrong until it was right. I know that's an odd way to put it, but it's the closest I've gotten to what I mean. In the morning I made coffee and cornbread and bacon, and had it on the table before anyone came down. Dora came first, down the stairs from the loft, which surprised me. I'd thought she'd slept on the cot with her sister. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the table, and then looked at me. I said, cornbread's hot. You can start while the others come. She climbed up into the chair. It was a big chair for her. She had to work at it, and I put a piece of cornbread in front of her, and she ate it slowly with both hands, watching me work at the stove. After a while she said, "It's good." I said, "Thank you." She said, "My papa used to cook breakfast too." I said, "Did he?" She said, "He burned it sometimes." I said, "I burn it sometimes too." She looked at the cornbread in her hands, then back at me. She said, "This one's not burned." I said, "Not this one." She went back to eating. I turned back to the stove. There was something about that exchange, the plainness of it, that has stayed with me a long time. She wasn't performing grief, and she wasn't performing bravery. She was just talking. the way children talk when they trust you enough to say the ordinary thing. Marta came down 20 minutes later with June. June looked at me like she'd forgotten I existed and was now making up her mind about me from the beginning. Marta looked at the table and the food, and then at me, and there was something in her face I couldn't entirely name, not surprise, something more layered, something that had to do with registering what she was looking at. She said, "You didn't need to do all this." I said, "You need to eat, so do they." She held my look for just a second before she looked away, and I knew from the slight change in her expression that she recognized the echo of what she'd said the night before, and she knew I'd done it on purpose. Not to be clever, just to give back what she'd given. We ate. It was a good meal. The kind that's good because everyone at the table is hungry and the food is simple and the room is warm and there's nothing urgent pulling anyone away from it. June asked about the horses, which ones were mine, what their names were, which one was fastest. Dora asked about the well because she'd seen it from the window, and I explained about how you look for water, where the signs are, what the soil tells you, how willows find it before people do. She listened with the fixed attention some children give to things that are technically interesting, not performing interest, actually having it. About 3 hours after breakfast, Aldous Finn came back with Purvis the blacksmith and a replacement axle fitting on a borrowed wagon. It took them most of the morning to get the coach out of the mud and the axle replaced, working in the road in the cool morning air, and Marta and I took the girls down to watch. The twins stood at the edge of the cottonwoods and watched Purvis work with that focused stillness that told me both of them were going to spend their lives looking hard at things that interested them. Purvis was a spare, dark-haired man who didn't talk while he worked. Finn helped without being asked, learning the job in real time, fetching and holding and watching. Once when the fitting slipped and Purvis caught his hand between the metal and the wood frame and said a word, I was glad the girls were standing far enough back to not quite make out. I walked to the creek and soaked my handkerchief in the cold water and brought it to him without comment. He nodded and wrapped it around his hand and went back to work. We didn't talk about it. Some things don't need talking about. By early afternoon, the coach was on the road and righted. Finn came and returned the barn key and shook my hand. His grip was solid. He'd been frightened the night before and he'd put it somewhere else, and what was left was solid. He said, "I'll remember this, sir." I said, "Just do the work. That's enough of a thing." Purvis waved off any payment. Said something about a customer I'd sent him years back that kept his shop busy for a year and a half and figured we were square. I couldn't remember which customer. He laughed, short and dry, and climbed up on his wagon and went. Finn loaded the bags. He helped the girls up the step and in through the coach door. He climbed up to the box. Marta didn't get in. She came over to me. We'd been maybe 10 feet apart and she walked it to 4 or 5. She said, "I want to say thank you properly." I said, "You don't need to." She said, "I know I don't." She reached out and put her hand on my arm just below the elbow. Not a handshake, firm, the grip of a working woman's hand. She said, "There are men who would have passed that road and kept walking." I said, "I was already there." She said, "You know what I mean." I did. I didn't say anything. I was looking at where her hand was on my arm. She said, "I'm going to Talbot. My husband's brother has a farm there. He's offered us a place to get on our feet." I said, "Talbot's good land from what I've heard." She said, "Is it far from here?" I said, "Half a day maybe, depending." She said, "On what?" I said, "On whether a person's in a hurry." She was quiet for a moment. I wasn't looking at her face. I was still looking at her hand on my arm. She said, "And if a person weren't in a hurry?" I looked up then. She was watching me with the same directness she'd used on the road when she'd first looked me over in the dusk. She wasn't smiling. She was just looking at me, clear and steady, the way she looked at things when she was already deciding and was checking her conclusion. I said, "Then a person might stop again, if they had reason to." She said, "You're not making this easy, Harlan." I said, I'm not trying to make it hard. She said, I know. She took her hand off my arm. She turned and walked to the coach and stepped up and in, and Fen closed the door behind her. I could see both girls through the window. Dora had her hand flat against the glass. I raised a hand to her and she kept her palm against the glass without waving, just kept it there, until the coach started to move. I stood there until I couldn't hear it anymore. Then I went back to the fence on the south side. I had a post that had been bothering me for a week, and I set it right that afternoon, tamped the earth down solid around it, stood back and looked at it. It was right. That first night after the coach left, I made myself supper and ate it at the table alone the way I always had. And it was the same supper and the same table and the same chair, but something about the room had shifted slightly. The way a room sometimes does after someone's been in it and gone. Not an unpleasant feeling, just a kind of awareness of the space, like when you move a piece of furniture you've had in one spot for years and the room looks right. You can't tell exactly why, just right. I did the dishes and went out to check the barn before dark the way I always did, and I noticed without meaning to that the second stall still smelled like the roan and like a stranger's saddle oil, and I left the door open a little longer than I needed to. Let the night air come in. I'd had neighbors over the years, good ones. Some I'd counted as friends, Gorman to the east, Hanneman south of the road, a man named Trask who'd sold his section and moved on years back. I didn't lack for company when I wanted it. That was never the trouble. The trouble was something else, something more particular, and I had only just that day understood what the particular thing was. I lay awake probably an hour past when I usually slept, looking at the ceiling, the cottonwoods outside doing their thing. In the 3 weeks between that day and when she came back, I worked the way I always worked, which is to say hard and in order, and I didn't think about Marta Ellison more than a reasonable amount. I told myself that anyway. I went over the well casing where I'd seen some cracking at the rim. I cut and split wood for 2 days to get ahead of the fall. I rode into Harmon's Creek for supplies and stopped in at Dennison's shop to pay off an old small debt I'd been meaning to clear. Nothing urgent, just the kind of thing that sits in the back of a man's mind. Dennison said I looked well. I said I was. What I didn't do, or tried not to do, was look at the south field and think about clay channels. But I thought about them most of the second week, walking the lower edge of the field in the evenings after supper, squatting down and picking up the soil, and thinking about gravel and grade, and how many loads that would be and where exactly to cut. By the third week, I'd started digging. That's not the end. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, I was up on the North Ridge checking on the late wheat when I heard a horse on the road below. Not Fenn's kind of pace, slower, heavier. A horse being ridden without urgency, by someone who knew where they were going and wasn't worried about getting there. I came down through the cottonwoods, and there was a small gray horse tied to my gate and no one in sight. I went inside. Marta was at my table. I don't know how she'd gotten in. I'd left the door unlocked the way I always did. And she had a cup of coffee in front of her that she'd made herself, and she was sitting the way she sat, upright but not stiff, hands around the cup, looking at the room. She said, I hope you don't mind. I said no. She said, the girls are at my brother-in-law's. I told them I was going for a ride. I said, long ride. She said half a day, depending. She was looking at me, not asking, more like confirming something she'd already settled in her own mind, coming here to make it official. I got a cup and poured coffee and sat down across from her. She said after a while, Talbot's not bad land. I said that's good. She said, my brother-in-law is a decent man. He'll give us a fair start. The girls have taken to him. I said I'm glad. She said, it's not the land I kept thinking about. She said it plain, no performance in it, just saying the true thing. I didn't answer right away. I was looking at the steam rising off the coffee. She said, I kept thinking about a man who came through some trees and didn't run and lifted my girls out of the mud and sent the driver on his own horse so the mail would get through, who cooked breakfast without being asked, who explained to my daughter about finding water like it was the most natural conversation in the world. I said, she asked about it. She said, yes, she asked and you told her, like she had every right to want to know. The fire was low. I got up and put a log on and she watched me do it. She said, I'm not here to put something on you that you didn't ask for. I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm just telling you what I kept thinking about these 3 weeks. You can do with that what you want to do. I said, what do you want to do with it? She said, I'd like to come back when I can, with the girls sometimes or alone sometimes, and see what it is. I said, I'd like that. She said, you sure? I said, I'm sure. She reached across the table, not to my arm this time, to my hand which was flat on the table, and she put her hand over it, warm, steady, just held it. She said, I thought you'd say that. I still wanted to hear you say it. I said, now you've heard it. She said, now I've heard it. We sat there a while. She drank her coffee. I drank mine. The fire caught and started putting out real heat. Outside, the cottonwoods were moving in the warm afternoon wind, the kind that smells of dry grass and the season about to change. She stayed until evening. We walked the south field. She wanted to see the drainage problem I'd mentioned at dinner that first night, and I showed her the clay shelf along the creek that held the water back and drowned the roots in a wet year. She crouched down and picked up a handful of the soil and felt the weight of it, turned it over. She said, I've seen something like this before. My father-in-law's property in Ohio had a strip of heavy clay along the lower field. He broke it up by cutting channels perpendicular to the slope, deep enough to get below the clay layer, and filling the bottom with gravel. I said, I've never tried that. She said, he tried it twice before he got the grading right. Third time it worked. I said, I've been wondering if it was worth the labor. She said, depends how much you want that field. I said, I want that field. She said, then it's worth the labor. We walked back in the dusk and I made a simple supper and she helped without being asked, finding what she needed in the kitchen without being told where things were, because she'd been paying attention the first time she was in this room and she hadn't stopped. We ate with the window open because the evening was mild and the lamp swayed a little in the breeze that came through, and neither of us talked much, but neither of us felt the need to. When she went to get her horse, she paused at the gate. She said, 2 weeks. I'll come back in 2 weeks or send word if I can't. I said, I'll be here. She said, I know you will. She rode toward Talbot, and I stood at the gate until the gray horse was gone past the bend in the road. Then I went in and washed the dishes and thought about what she'd said about the channels in the clay, whether I could get them cut before the ground got too hard in the fall. She came back in 2 weeks and 2 weeks after that, and then there was a stretch of nearly a month when she couldn't come harvest at her brother-in-law's, a sickness one of the girls had, one thing and another. She sent word each time. The letters were brief and practical. She had a practical hand, clear and even, and she didn't apologize and she didn't make promises she couldn't see clearly. She just told me what was happening and what she expected. I respected that a great deal. I've never had much patience with people who apologize for things they couldn't help or promise things they can't see. I won't pretend that month didn't go slow, but I had the channels to dig, and I dug them. All 15 yards of it, gravel hauled from the creek bed in the wheelbarrow, 6 loads over 3 days, working in the cool morning hours when the ground was still damp from the night. I got the grading wrong the first time and had to recut the eastern third. Got it wrong again on the second attempt, not badly, just a fraction of pitch off. Third time I laid a level string and took my time and got it right. When Marta came back the 4th visit and we walked out to the south field, she crouched down again and looked at what I'd done and said, "You did the grading right." I said, "3rd try." She looked up at me, and that time she smiled, all the way, and it was a good smile, nothing performed in it. The second visit, the one when she came alone the first time and we walked the field, she told me more about Ohio and her parents and what it had been like growing up on her father's farm, which was a prosperous farm, more prosperous than what she'd found when she came west. She said she'd spent her first year out here adjusting her sense of what words like enough and good meant, recalibrating the whole scale of what was adequate and what wasn't, what a good crop looked like, and what a hard winter meant compared to what she'd known. Her husband had been an optimistic man, and she'd loved him for it, the way you love someone for the quality that sustains them even when it also risks them. Sometimes she'd wondered whether optimism was what had killed him, whether he'd stayed on the trail a week past when a more cautious man would have turned back and found a doctor. She said this without bitterness, just turning it over slowly, the way you turn a thing over when you've been thinking about it a long time and haven't said it out loud much. I said, that kind of thinking doesn't go anywhere useful. She said, I know it doesn't, I still think it. I said, I know. She looked at me, she said, do you? I told her about Catherine, about the first house burning, not the loss of the house so much, though the loss was real, but the particular feeling of coming back to a foundation and ash, and understanding that everything you'd built from nothing was gone and you were starting over from nothing again. About the fifth-year frost, standing in the black field in the morning cold. Not to trade tragedies, I don't believe in doing that, but because she'd said a true thing and it seemed right to say one back. She listened without interrupting, which I respected. When I finished, she didn't say she was sorry or offer something consoling. She just nodded once, like a person filing something away. She said, you rebuilt it twice. I said, once, the fire was the first one. She said, then you built it twice. First time from nothing and second time from nothing again. That's different from failing and rebuilding. That's just building twice over. I'd never thought about it that way. I sat with it a moment. Then I said, I suppose that's right. She said, it is right. She didn't say it to make me feel better. She said it because it was accurate. That was the kind of woman she was. The visits got longer. Then they stopped being visits and started being something else, some other word I didn't have yet. She came on a Friday and left on a Sunday, then Thursday and left Monday. The girls came with her sometimes and not others, and when they came, June wanted to see everything and asked 20 questions about every piece of equipment in the barn. And Dora went straight to the well with a look about her like she'd already decided it was hers to understand. The winter between the visits and the living together was a hard one. Not the hardest I'd seen worse, but hard. A stretch of 3 weeks in January when the temperature didn't come up past 10 degrees, and the creek froze solid enough to walk on, and I lost one of the older ewes to the cold, found her stiff in the corner of the barn one morning. You do what you can, and sometimes what you can isn't enough. Marta had been supposed to come in late January, and the weather kept her away. I got a letter, her clear practical hand, saying the road south of Talbot was closed and she'd come when she could. I read it twice and put it in the drawer where I kept important papers and went out to feed the animals in the cold. She came in early February when the weather broke, and she came with the girls that time, all 3 of them on horseback, which surprised me. I hadn't known the girls could ride, and they came up the road at a canter with the breath of the horses making clouds in the cold air and Dora in front of the saddle with Marta, holding on, and June on her own horse, which was a small brown horse from her uncle's barn. They all looked cold and pleased with themselves. June said, dismounting, we've been practicing. I said, I can see that. Marta swung down and got Dora down after her, and they came inside, and I made coffee and the girls got warm at the fire, and I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that I was glad the road was open, and I was glad they'd come, and I'd been thinking about this particular moment for 3 weeks, and it was better than I'd been picturing it, the way good things usually are. By the following spring, Marta and the girls were living at the farm. That wasn't a single decision so much as a series of smaller ones that accumulated until the larger one was obvious. She spent more time here than there. The girls had started to know the land. June knew where the good mushrooms came up in the north pasture in September. Dora knew the sound the well rope made when the bucket hit the water surface, and when it hit the bottom. Marta knew where the cold corner of the kitchen was in winter and had taken to hanging a heavy curtain there, which helped. She knew which board in the sleeping loft creaked and stepped over it without looking. One evening in late October, sitting at the table after supper, she said, "I've been thinking about the spring planting." I said, "What about it?" She said, "The section you let go to grass on the north side. You said the soil gave out. I've been reading about green manure turning a cover crop back in before it seeds. Some farmers have brought sections back with it." I said, "I've heard of that, never tried it." She said, "I think it's worth trying. I can help with it. The girls can help with it. We'd have to decide by February to get the seed in time." I looked at her. She said, "I'm not suggesting anything you haven't already been thinking about." I said, "I know." She said, "I just want to say it plain. I want to be here in February." I said, "I want that too." She said, "All right then." She got up and took her cup to the basin, and that was that. No ceremony about it. Just the plain statement of what was true and what we both wanted, and then moving on to the next thing. That's how most things went with Marta. Not because she lacked feeling, she had as much feeling as anyone I've known, but because she'd learned the same way I'd learned that the plain statement of a true thing was worth more than a long performance of it. You say what's true. You go on. By the spring after the following one we were married, quiet in Harmon's Creek, with Finn as one of the witnesses. I'd seen him half a dozen times since that first night. The male route brought him past regularly now, and Purvis as the other. Purvis said he figured he'd earned a witness spot. I told him he had. We had a meal at the hotel in Harmon's Creek. The six of us, me and Marta and the girls and the two witnesses. And Purvis, who was not a talkative man at work, turned out to be good company at a table, and Finn had grown up some from the frightened young driver of that first night and was becoming a solid man. June made a speech that went on too long and was also the best speech I've ever heard. Dora ate everything on her plate and then finished what Finn left on his. June asked to help plant the corn that year and I let her, and she was serious about it the way she was serious about everything, every seed at the right depth and spacing, checking her work as she went. Dora said she didn't want to plant corn, she wanted to learn the well, and I started teaching her. By that summer she could read the ground as well as most grown men, watching for the signs, the way the grass grew, the color of the soil in a dry spell where the willows bent. Better than some men I'd known who'd been doing it for years. We put in the cover crop on the north section that first spring, the way Marta had said. It took 2 full seasons before we could see results, which is how that kind of work goes. It doesn't give you anything back right away, you're just making a deposit. By the 3rd year the soil had a different color to it, darker, and we planted a test strip and it grew. I don't know what to call that feeling except something like justice, except that's not quite right either. More like the satisfaction of being patient enough, and the land finally saying yes back. The south field drained right the first wet spring after the channels went in. I'm not sure I'd ever been as satisfied by anything as I was standing at the edge of that field in April, watching the water run off the way it was supposed to, down through the gravel out toward the creek, the soil above it dark and good. Marta was standing next to me. She didn't say anything. She just stood there with me and looked at it. That was enough. I've been sitting on this porch a long time now, thinking about how to say the last of this, because I want to get it right. I'm not a man who was empty before any of this happened. I don't want to tell it that way because it isn't true. I had the farm and the work and the seasons, and I knew who I was and what I was good at, and I wasn't unhappy most of the time. I was a man doing his work, which is a decent thing to be. 16 years of doing it alone, and I'd gotten good at it. But there's a difference, and I didn't know this until I knew it, between doing a thing alone and doing a thing with someone who understands what the thing costs and what it's worth. Between maintaining a place and building one. Between a house that holds one person and a house that holds four. Not a better or worse difference in every case. Just a different kind of life, and one I didn't know I was missing until the missing was over. What Marta gave me wasn't rescue. I want to be clear about that. She wasn't rescuing anything. I was standing fine on my own 2 feet when that coach axle broke. What she gave me was her choosing. That's the whole word for it. She looked at me clearly, with no particular illusion about what I was, a middle-aged farmer with a square house and a drainage problem and a roan horse and not much else. And she rode half a day and sat at my table and put her hand over mine and said, "I kept thinking about you." And she meant it. She said it once, meant it completely, and everything that came after came from that. She could have stayed in Talbot. She had reasons to be careful. She had those girls to think about and a new start waiting with family nearby and solid ground under her feet. She came back anyway. She came back because she looked clearly at a thing and called it what it was and didn't talk herself out of it or wait around to see if something better came along. She just came. That's not a small thing, that's the whole thing. I think about it sometimes the way you think about something that was almost not. The way a particular Thursday could just as easily have been a day I stayed on my side of the cottonwoods, heard a sound and kept working. Some days are like that. You make a choice without knowing it's a choice, the ordinary kind you don't think about afterward because nothing came of it. That Thursday I went through the trees. I don't know what it was that made me go rather than stay, whether it was habit or something older, some sense a man gets about when a sound means trouble. But I went. Marta says she saw me come out from the trees and she knew right away I wasn't going to cause her any trouble. Not because I looked kind or gentle, she says I didn't look particularly either, but because I walked straight to the problem. She says men who mean to cause trouble look at the woman first. I walked past her to the coach. I hadn't thought about that. I think about it now. There's something in that worth saying plainly. Most of what we are shows in what we do without thinking about it. I didn't choose to walk past her to the coach. I just walked there because that's where the children were, and the children were frightened, and there was something to be done. That's the whole of it. Not a decision so much as a disposition. The direction a man moves when he's been a certain kind of man long enough that it's just the way he moves. What I know is that Marta saw it. That she was a woman who looked at a thing carefully and saw it for what it was, and she looked at me carefully and saw something worth riding half a day back to. And that has been enough, more than enough, for every year since. I'm sitting on this porch right now writing this, or telling it, I suppose, with the evening coming in over the wheat. Dora's 17 now and can read a field the way I read words. June is in Harmon's Creek training to be a school teacher and comes home every third weekend and talks more than she did as a child, which I hadn't thought was possible, and I don't mind it, not one word of it. They're both good people. They became good people here, on this land with this work to do, and that means something to me that I can't quite put into words but don't need to. Marta came out a little while ago and stood behind my chair with her hands on my shoulders for a moment, the way she does sometimes when the evening is good, and there's no particular reason for it except that it is good and she is here and I am here. She didn't say anything. She went back inside and I heard the lamp come on in the kitchen, that small sound when the flame catches, and the light came through the window, yellow and even. The fence on the south side is still standing. I set those posts right and they've held through 6 winters. The north section is producing again. The south field drains clean. The well is good water, cold in summer the way good water should be. I went through the trees when I heard the sound. That's all I did. Walked through the cottonwoods and lifted 2 girls out of the mud and told a woman she could have the loft for the night. The rest came from that. From being where I was and doing what the situation called for, and being the kind of man I was. and a woman being the kind of woman she was, and the two of those things finding each other at a dip in the road where the mud ran deep. I'm grateful for the mud. I've thought about that too. The wheat is gold in the evening light right now, the way it gets. Everything that's supposed to be here is here. That's most of what I know about how a life gets made.